Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. in Switzerland, it's Space Café Web Talk time. Our Space Café Web Talk, 33 minutes with Theresa Hitchens, will begin soon. Thank you for joining us today for Star Wars or Star Trek, the future of military space. As always, we appreciate your participation and your ongoing feedback that is very valuable for us and help us to improve. I'm Torsten Kriening, your host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly or daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. Our latest episode, number 25, features a wonderful Alice Gorman talking about space archaeology. Check it out. It's worth to listen to. We also keep our fan shop open online for you to support us actively and become a space watcher. The edition 1 has cool items for you, your friends, and the ones you love. Your support is needed to keep our work alive, and we do that for you. If you have missed any of our previous shows, we have an archive available on our webpage in the event section and on YouTube. We host our Space Café web talks live weekly. My guest today is someone I really admire for her outstanding work. She is one of the greatest and absolute competent people in our industry. With that, a very warm welcome, Theresa Hitchens. It's an absolute honor to have you in my show.
Thank you, Torsten. I really appreciate the kind words, and it's great to be here. I only wish we were doing it in person, in the real, as we said on your deck.
Yes, absolutely. And one day, I mean, we can dream of one day we will do that. So let me give our audience a bit of a background of you. Theresa is the Space and Air Force reporter at Breaking Defense. The former defense news editor was a senior research associate at the University of Maryland Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland. Before that, she spent 6 years in the lovely city of Geneva, Switzerland, as the director of UNIDIR, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. She is a great sci-fi geek and voracious reader and enthusiastic cook, as we can see on Facebook from time to time. No, actually daily, daily. And it's so delicious. It looks so great. And all these writings about it, I mean, my wife usually gets it from Pinterest, all this cool stuff, but I mean, I have to send her to your page as well. And she is a dabbler in poetry. And she is a proud mom of a son. Theresa, happy to have you here with us today. So let's kick it off without further ado. What are you with, Star Trek or Star Wars? Or let's ask another one, is this Baby Yoda just cute or a mass murder, as we have seen in The Mandalorian? And with that, I let him go.
Well, I think that's the question, right? Well, what future do we want for military space? And if you think about what those two franchises show, Star Wars is essentially a world in perpetual war, where space is a battlefield almost constantly in each of the movies. And if you look at Star Trek, you have a different feel. Remember that there are rules in Star Trek. The Federation is a peaceful, supposedly peaceful Federation looking to explore. And when there is conflict, there are rules about how you do it, from set your phasers to stun. Don't know if you remember that, but phasers are always set to stun first in Star Trek, to the neutral zone between the Federation and the Romulans that sets up a buffer that the militaries aren't to cross. So that was why I thought of naming the talk this, because I wanted to draw a contrast between what are extremes in science fiction, but as you said, I'm a science fiction buff, and I firmly believe that science fiction can teach us a lot about both our present and our future.
No, wonderful. I mean, I think many of us are Trekkies, as you mentioned before, but I mean, Star Wars just doing much better merchandising.
This is true.
I mean, I really, to prepare it, I try to find something what I have at home from Star Trek, and I have to admire. No, I mean, I have all the stuff what you can get from Star Wars, but not so much from Star Trek. And when I pointed out or invited to our show, I had many people coming back saying, "Oh, but the Expanse, that's the ultimate one. That's a pretty cool one." So, and yeah, I mean, when was Star Trek or when did Star Trek started? When did Lucas started Star Wars? I mean, come on, in the 70s, in the 80s, I think. I mean, at least when we were young.
Yes, Star Wars was the first movie came out in 1979. I believe maybe it was 77, the year I graduated from high school, 1977. And of course, Star Trek had started long before that in the 60s. I remember vaguely watching reruns as a child. That was actually when I became addicted to Star Trek. Was as a small child. It was on the TV in reruns when I was 7, 8. And of course, The Expanse is new. And if anyone wants to learn some lessons about man's expanse or humankind's expanse to the solar system and to the rest of space, take a look at The Expanse, because it's a cautionary tale. It's a way we do not wish to go.
Absolutely. So let's move now to the bitter reality. Let's go into details. What kind of weapons do we see in development in the military space sector, and who is the driver for it? I mean, it's a more rhetorical question, of course, or about the driver, but I mean, you have this vast knowledge of what kind of weapons. I mean, is it just the Star Wars? No, what is it? SDI initiative from Reagan that we have seen, or I mean, it started much earlier.
Mm-hmm. I'm first going to caveat this by saying I'm going to talk about weapons and space, not space weapons. And that's for a number of reasons, and it has to do with the fact that people define space weapons differently. Where you sit is where you stand in all things political. So I'm going to talk about weapons and space. And the second thing I want to push, and I want to make sure that people understand, because there is a lot of rhetoric today that is, at best, perhaps a myopic view, and at worst, historical revisionism, that somehow in the recent past, space was a benign environment where no one had to worry about military threats. That's not true. Space has been used for military purposes since the dawn of this space age. The Soviets and the United States were both looking at how they could use space to in the Cold War, and how they could use it to dominate, if you want, the other superpower. And this includes tests of different kinds of anti-satellite weapons, both those based on the ground and those based in space. So fundamentally, space has been a domain where there has been military activity since humankind has been using space. And that's important as a groundwork, as a foundational thought for how we go forward and how we think about space and how we think about the politics that are happening around the question of military uses of space, okay? You asked about types of space weapons. There are fundamentally three basic types of weapons that can be used in the space environment. One is ground to space. These are the ones that we most typically think about, anti-satellite weapons that are based on the ground, that are missiles essentially that smash into a satellite and blow it to smithereens. Those types of weapons have been tested now by the United States, by China, by Russia, most recently by India. There are many other countries who have the capability to do that if they so wish. The second type of weapons is space-to-space weapons, and this would be any use of a space object to harm in some way another object in space. The third type is space-to-ground. And this is the proverbial Star Wars, Reagan's SDI program, where weapons are based in space to hit targets either close to the ground, as in missiles lifting off from the ground, or on the ground or at sea. So those are the three basic types of weapons that can be used in a space environment. And then those weapons can be what are often termed reversible or irreversible, meaning they can be destructive or they can merely disable something. And when you talk about reversible weapons, generally militaries are talking about things like using radio frequency jammers or using lasers to blind an imager, or using cyber attacks to hack or scramble or, change a satellite's course. So that's kind of the taxonomy of what weapons are up there. I think we'll have to talk in more detail about the drivers. As I mentioned, this competition in space started with the Cold War and the Soviet Union and the United States. In recent eras, it has stepped up primarily between the three big geopolitical actors, which is the U.S., Russia, and China now. But that doesn't let other countries and their militaries necessarily off the hook.
No, absolutely. And Kevin mentioned it, and we will come to this a bit later, that NATO has established a space center in Ramstein in Germany, and also the Center of Excellence in Toulouse recently. The French military is moving forward on that. But I think we will cover that. But just to go with the flow, so who is developing these weapons? Are these really only governments, or thanks God, only governments today? Or do we see other actors as well? And what is the status? As you mentioned, we have seen the anti-satellite tests are demonstrated, so check, with all the bad reasons and the results from that as well. We have seen a number of satellite on-orbit maneuvers when inspecting foreign satellites and see what they're doing. So, hanging out with them and just listen in a bit and whatever intelligence you can do. So, I think that is what we see, and with the ongoing growing capacity on orbit servicing capabilities, I think that will not decline. We will see it increasing for all of the reasons. So, but what is the status of the weapons in general? Are they functional?
Well, again, you can't make a blanket statement. And I think if anyone wants to learn about the status of what I would call capabilities that could be used, notice I said could, capabilities that could be used for counter space purposes, that is, as weapons to destroy satellites. You should take a look at the 2021 editions and the older editions of the Space Threat Assessment by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Global Counter Space Capabilities Report by the Secure World Foundation. You can find both of those online, and I have not seen anything that's any better at looking at the various capabilities that are being tested and operated and used, not just by nation states, but also by businesses, by commercial companies that could have some applicability to use as weapons. Okay, so we have a couple of different things going on here. I said that space has been used for military purposes since the Cold War, and that is true. What has changed since then are a couple of different factors, and they're all just probably equally important. One is that, of course, technology is advanced. In the early stages of the Cold War, really, the space tech was so difficult. It was only the Soviet Union and the United States in space, and Europe came third. Space is still hard. Even today, space is still hard, but it's less hard, okay? So technology has advanced, miniaturization, it costs less to get things into space. And that has fundamentally changed the space environment in a holistic way, which has meant that there are more actors, both nation states and commercial companies in space, because they can. And because space is useful both for economic purposes, as we all know, but it's useful for military purposes today in a way it wasn't during the Cold War. Space was primarily a strategic thing in the Cold War. Satellites were primarily used for intelligence purposes, to spy on each other, right? And they were directly connected to communications for the nuclear forces of the two superpowers. Those two things remain the same today, but there are added uses for militaries because of the changes in technology, which means that space assets, satellites, are being used for kind of day-to-day military operations, for planning logistics, for communications, even today for targeting weapons. The Global Positioning System, GPS, position, timing, and navigation satellites, of which Europe has Galileo. The Russians have a system, the Chinese have built a system. Those can be used and are used to target weapons. So space has been integrated into military forces because it's useful for military forces in ways that are vastly different than how they were used during the Cold War. So those things have changed. And as a result, once a technology or a capability becomes important to a military, it becomes a target for a military's adversaries. That's just how the world works. That's how militaries work. It should not be unexpected. And the question is, at what point do the political systems of various countries and the international community decide that there have to be constraints on either what weapons capabilities are deployed or how weapons capabilities are constrained? And that is the question. You've got a kind of a tipping point now with many countries. You mentioned NATO, but there's also Israel, there's India, Japan is even beefing up its space capabilities and considering counterspace capabilities. I mean, South Africa, Brazil, any country with an advanced space program is pretty much now thinking about how they might use space militarily and how they might try to destroy the military advantages that adversaries get from space. So that's a political question and not a military question. Okay? The militaries are doing what you expect militaries to do. And you asked where things were. If you look at the editions of those two papers, you will see that there are some space counterspace capabilities that are in use today. Russia, for example, has used jamming capabilities, jammers based on the ground to jam satellites in space widely. In Ukraine, in Crimea, they've messed around with Norwegian satellites during NATO exercises. Reports say that China has started to train its troops on how to use ground-based anti-satellite weapons, which they tested in 2007. So some things have been used, some things are being ready to be used, and other things are still science fiction, such as back in the 90s, I think there was a lot of talk about a system called Rods from God, that would essentially put a mothership in space that carried a bunch of tungsten rods that would then be shot down, if you will, really not shot, but using gravity, to a target on the Earth to destroy it. And that type of capability still remains science fiction because the laws of physics haven't changed in the last 20 years, and the laws of physics make that pretty untenable.
Why using rods from God when we have these new kind of hypersonic weapons coming along? So what is the difference? So
yeah, I mean, a hypersonic weapon is not really a space weapon, is it?
Okay, that's the question, how we define it, where it travels. So, but I mean, you guys are reporting extensively on the defense stuff in your magazine. And yesterday we had something that spilled over to us as well. I mean, we look into the more nicer space environment globally as we define it. And we reported on the US intelligence expects China to expand their space weapons. And I think some of them you answered, but you also see the US Space Force, Russia, China, Japan, you mentioned them before, NATO and others, seeing as the space as domain of warfare. Can you explain the expansion of nations seeking these military space capabilities? I mean, one is to do it to protect their own territory, yeah, as you said, spying on others, space weather, GPS, whatever it is. I mean, that's something you need as military to operate, but how far are we? I mean, are we targeting, as mentioned earlier, objects in space actively besides shooting down their own satellites, what they demonstrated? So
I think that's a question that I'm not fully able to answer because so much of what happens in this arena is heavily classified. What I can
But that's why we have this talk.
That's why we have this talk. What I can tell you is that the three major space powers, Russia, China, and the United States, are locked in a worsening geopolitical spiral. There are greater tensions between those three countries than there have been, well, for a very long time. And it's not really between, because China, although I wouldn't say China and Russia are allies, because I don't think they are fundamentally, but tensions between Russia and the United States, and between especially the United States and China, are very, very high, and perhaps higher than they have been certainly since the height of the Cold War, and things like the Cuban Missile Crisis between the United States and the Soviet Union. And you remember what I just said about the way countries are using military space has changed, and it made it a fundamental part of how you project power. So all three of those countries have been pursuing the ability to use space as a means to project military power. And therefore, all three of those countries look at each other's space capabilities and realize that by building weapon systems to take out those space capabilities, they have a better chance of winning a war. And therefore, all three are pursuing capabilities to not only attack each other's satellites, but to attack each other's counter space capabilities. So in the United States, rhetorically at least, says that it is primarily focused on developing capabilities to neutralize the attack capabilities of Russia and China. China and Russia would say the same thing. They are neutralizing the ability of the United States to use space to attack them. And that's the driver. And because those political relationships between Russia, China, and the United States are fundamentally important for the rest of the world, that drives the rest of the world's militaries in a certain direction. So we have a certain kind of momentum right now, but I also want to point out that we had a certain kind of momentum in the same direction in the 1980s under the Bush, under the Reagan administration, and then later in the 2000s under the G.W. Bush administration. So we also had the same drivers in the 1970s, when both the Russians and the United States were building anti-satellite weapons capabilities, and they were working on short-range or intermediate-range nuclear weapons, which were linked together at the time. So this is a cyclical phenomenon in a way that is linked to the state of geopolitical relations. I just told you that some weapons, some systems, it depends on, again, how you describe weapons, jammers have been used in conflict. They've been used in peacetime. Iran used jammers against satellites in peacetime during its election because it didn't want the political news in its country. So again, it depends on the weapon, and it depends on, where you sit. I would say that we're at a very serious crossroads right now. Probably the most serious crossroads in my lifetime about whether countries choose to go full bore into developing space arsenals, or whether things remain kind of on a medium boil, where people are developing capabilities but not necessarily deploying them en masse or and investing in large-scale infrastructures to use them. And part of the reason we're at a tipping point is precisely because the major countries have begun to build forces, people, structures around the use of military space power. Space Force in the United States, but China has an equivalent, not quite an equivalent, but they have a force structure around their counter space capabilities, as does Russia.
I see. But how does that all go along with the upcoming and growing commercial space development? Because, that's what we are aiming for. Besides research, we have this discussion between research and commercial already. Yeah. Should we go there? Should we harvest? Shall we take more satellites? La, 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 all of that. And then we have the military, which are, before Elon launched all his satellites, had the biggest amount of active satellites in space.
Well, again, I think I need to correct you there. Elon wasn't the one who changed that balance. That balance has been changing for a number of years now. Remember I said there are many, many, many more satellites in space now. There are more than 2,000. When I first started with working on these issues, there was something like not even 800 satellites in space, and most of them were owned by governments. And now there are some 2,000, and most of them, and growing every day with Elon's SpaceX. But other constellations, Planet, OneWeb, and the bulk of them are commercial. And that fundamentally changes the environment again, from an environment that was once dominated by governments and militaries to an environment that is now dominated by commercial concerns. That changes the politics. And remember this question at the bottom line, whether our future is Star Wars or Star Trek or The Expanse for that matter, is a political question. Yeah. And the commercial uses of space and the value of commercial uses of space to countries changes their fundamental political cost-benefit analysis, because you have to weigh what might happen in the military sphere against how that might affect the commercial sphere. And up to now, I don't think governments have been thinking that holistically. The militaries have been continuing kind of down their military path, where you, again, would expect militaries to go. It is their job, after all, to prepare for the worst case scenario, to prepare for war. That's what militaries do. They are not the departments of peace. But it is the civil political masters whose job it is to prepare for national security. And national security is a broader thing than war and peace, isn't it? it's economics, it's fundamentally a bigger concern. And therefore, this explosion of commercial capability and the explosion of benefits, economic benefits, societal benefits from commercial activity has to start weighing on the consciousnesses of those making the decisions about where their national government funds are spent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good thing. Fundamentally, it's a good thing.
I try to envision now, when the White Navy was rolled out in the US to protect the trade routes. So, and I think that's what we see now in space, expecting that there is a huge ecosystem and economy starting in space. And we are going this path. Of course, we are not harvesting our asteroids right now, or the moon, or wherever we're going to go. But it's more a matter of time than a matter of are we doing it, at least from the mindset right now. That might change if, as you say, political system change. Who has thought about this pandemic thing 2 years back? It was just, no, it can't happen, never, ever, yeah? So it was unimaginable. So, if things go the right way, then we have the situation that we might see. But what are the constraints you see on military actions in peace, especially in peace, and war?
That's where we get to the rub. As I said, up to now, the militaries have kind of been going, off on their own military path, and there hasn't been a good amount of civilian government thought put into what do we actually need to do for today to protect our economies and to protect our future economies in space, to protect the space environment, to make sure that, like the high seas, it is usable into the foreseeable future for the benefits of ourselves on the ground, of humans,
Absolutely.
Or of our nation states, okay? Because fundamentally, countries, are still thinking about themselves as nation states, right? They're not really thinking about the wider humanity of Star Trek. That's not what your politicians are doing on a day-to-day basis, no matter what they say in public. They need to get reelected, at least in democratic countries. But even as commercial companies are starting to push out into the frontier and to build an actual economy in space, that's what you were talking about. Again, we'll talk about the expanse in a minute. You see, actually, I think, hopeful signs that a number of governments are now way more serious than they were 20 years ago about the idea of having rules of the road in space, both for peacetime activities and for military activities. Because political leaders and national security leaders are beginning to understand that they can do things in the military sphere that will harm them in the economic sphere. That will be, in Europe, you would say, an own goal for your own prosperity as a country. They're also seeing commercial companies outstrip the sets of rules and regulations that are already there for space activities, both at a national level and at an international level, which is why you had the discussions in the COPUOS recently about guidelines for long-term stability, which were talking about how actors use space in the peacetime and trying to create guidelines for protecting the space environment for future use. Again, think about the high seas and fishing. Okay, these are fundamentally the same problems. There are differences, but conceptually they're the same problems. Also, there is a concern, and this is a legitimate concern that only I think is starting to be an itch in the question of national security leaders, but is going to have to be faced sooner or later, is how far do you want commercial companies to drive what you have to do as a nation state? Do you really want commercial companies starting to mine asteroids and compete with commercial companies from other countries without there being a rule set to prevent those two companies in essence going to war? And I want you to think about the historical situation of the East India Company and how the East India Company in many ways dragged Britain into wars it did not want. Okay? And I don't think that's a situation anyone wants. And therefore, you also are starting to see a scramble in both in the international community and in individual countries to figure out how to deal with, to constrain the activities of commercial providers, commercial actors, while also encouraging the activities of commercial actors to do more things that benefit the economy, okay? So, but to put boundaries around how they do that. And thirdly, for the first time in my, professional career, I am seeing some serious discussion in major spacefaring countries about how we need to constrain, perhaps, military activities in space. And the manifestation of that was the UK resolution at the United Nations last year to ask countries to come to the first committee, which deals with security issues, not the fourth committee that deals with UN COPUS and economic and peaceful uses of space. Countries are supposed to come to the first committee and talk about, or to provide a report on their threat perceptions, what they see as irresponsible and responsible behavior in the military sphere. Okay? And that's important because we have constraints on military actions in every other domain of warfare. There are constraints about how you operate warships. There are constraints on how and where you put your land forces. There are constraints on where you fly your military airplanes. This is not the case in space because we had not gotten to the point where there was enough military and commercial use of space to warrant politicians paying attention. So, do you think we will go there? Yes, I think that we will have to. You mean that we go toward constraints? Yes.
That we get it in the politicians' mindset that we have to have these rules and regulation that you mentioned before. So, I mean, that would be for me. I would put it on the hope sheet,
That is the hopeful feed. That is are we moving toward the Star Trek? And I think there is actually a lot of hope. The problem is, or the question is whether it will be early in the military game or later in the military game. So before the fact or after the fact. One of the, and you can compare this to perhaps the Biological Weapons Convention versus the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the Biological Weapons Convention was signed, which actually bans a class of weapons, as we all know. And people like to say that you can't ban weapons. That is not true. It has been done. And the Biological Weapons Convention happened before there was widespread use of biological weapons. Good thing. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty fundamentally was after the fact, after nuclear weapons had been used. So that's the question. That's the crossroads we stand at, right? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball any more than anyone else does, right?
Our production team waves the red flag that we should, and before they cut us off, there are a number more questions, and we see here the engagement with our wonderful audience. So I will send this question over to you and ask you to to answer them in a brief way, or that we can send them over.
Online? Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah,
I can answer them and send them to you in an email or something, and you can put them up. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be wonderful. So,
can I say one thing before we end? I just wanted to say one thing about the UK resolution, because it's really interesting. So this UK resolution that countries are supposed to respond to, the responses actually due, if I am not incorrect, on May 4th. And do you know what May 4th is? It's International Star Wars Day.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if the UK did that on purpose or not, but if they did, way to go.
Absolutely, yeah. And May the 4th, we do have another, it's a Tuesday, so we have another Space Café. So, and I will come to that in a minute. I mean, it was an absolute fantastic talk. I mean, my last question is how will a war in space potentially look like? I mean, I spoke with Bled and Brown about it already when his new book came out last year. So, but also this question to you. I mean, it's for me. I can't imagine to have a nuclear blast in space, because everything what you said before will be then taking off. So, and we are back in the digital Stone Age. Yeah. So is this more this particular, hey, I'm chasing you, chasing me, so things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, if you talk to Bled, then you know that the physics, the laws of, remember, the laws of physics are important in space.
Yeah.
And Space War won't look like Star Wars, and it'll look much more like The Expanse.
Yeah.
And I mean, anybody would be stupid to use a nuclear weapon in space, but they would be stupid to use a nuclear weapon on Earth, and yet people are still pursuing nuclear weapons. So, you know. People aren't.
I mean, as you mentioned, there is some hope there, or especially in Vienna, going on the UN Copius right now after last year in hibernation mode, so to say. Yeah. At least this year it's online, and I really encourage you to follow it. There were a few interesting statements from countries and nations that we haven't heard before. So I think we are moving, especially towards LTS and all of these things, in a good way. I mean, I'm afraid. I mean,
slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. We are moving slowly. Of course, we're moving slowly. But I know guys that are moving very fast. And today I'm in their location, and it's my tech team, so which will run over me here and will cut us off. So I'm afraid we have to come to an end. Even I would love to continue this discussion at another point, and I think on the same topics. I'm afraid, but be assured that we will continue following all the security, the military topics are in our future Space Cafés and web talks. And yeah, our next Space Cafés are we have some interesting lineup. This week is a bit slower, so we only have this one today. So, but next week we will start on the 27th with Chris Welch, Professor Chris Welch, my good friend from the ISU, about art in space. I mean, what a lovely topic. It's definitely not my core knowledge, so I will learn as we go. So, but it's a wonderful topic to discuss about. And then on the 29th, we will kick off the Space Café Scotland by the wonderful Angela Matters of Think Tank Maths. So talking with the Scottish environment about things that are going on there. A day later, just a few hours later actually, we will start our first Space Café Greater Bay Area China with Blaine Corcio. And he will talk with Greg Daphner of GAPSAT. So, and for those of you that haven't heard this term Greater Bay Area China before, it's Hong Kong, Macau, and Guangzhou. So, I mean, a very interesting area and when it comes to space. 4th of May, as we mentioned before, I have my 33 minutes with Timidayo Onyo-san of Africa in Space, Space in Africa. An interesting discussion with him about this huge continent, what's going on there. And on the 6th of May, we will have the second Space Café Germany by Andreas Schippers, and I hope we will get the guests that we would like to talk to, and it will be an astronaut, so that would be awesome. On the 7th of May, Then we will have another launch, and that is Space Café Canada. And we couldn't find anyone better than the wonderful Dr. Jessica West. And her first guest will be Dr. David Kendall of the Outer Space Institute. So, I mean, we listen to our audience and try to make the magic happen. So all these events are online on Eventbrite. So as always, we would like to hear your feedback. Please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily or bi-weekly newsletters. And if you like to treat yourself with something special, become a Space Watcher today. Your support will help us. Take a credit card and visit our fan shop at shop.SpaceWatch.Global. I know, but we need your support to continue our work. Thank you all very much for your interest today. And thank you very much, Theresa, for this inspiring talk. And also want to say bye from this young fellow here. I've taken it away from my grandson. So I have to say officially. But again, thanks for being my guest, and thanks to the entire team behind the scene for doing their great job week by week again, and for the flexibility, especially today. I hope you all will stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you next week. In the meantime, visit our website, follow us on social media, but don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you very much, Theresa. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.